thank you, Ryan. And unfortunately, I'm not going to do something as brilliant as Narima's talk, because I'd like to acknowledge the Wajak people with whom I've had the pleasure of working for 4 decades now. And what Narima didn't say was that her first stint in Heritage was with me. And I find it interesting that they never came to talk to me about these issues. So, and of course, one of the reasons I've moved so much and done so much is that no one wants to keep me, apart from myself. So I want to talk about trying to improve heritage methodologies, and I'm going to talk about, very technically, about the Aboriginal Heritage Act. This is the Aboriginal Heritage of 1972. As you know, there was an attempt to introduce a new act which failed. Durham has mentioned that. I want to suggest that key elements of the act, this is a long title, are customary use by and traditional to the original inhabitants. So the act covers 4 sorts of sites. So basically, A is archaeological sites, B, sacred sites, C, places that, in the opinion of the committee, are of historic, anthropological, archaeological, ethnographic interest and should be preserved for the importance and significance of the state's cultural heritage. And that is defined, the significance of the state's cultural heritage is defined by the Heritage Act of Western Australia, which in fact relies very much on the Borough Charter and so on. And the last bit, place to which material that the Act applies to has been stored, not including, of course, the museum. So, under the Act, the Aboriginal, what's now called the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Committee, formerly the ACMC, has to evaluate places in terms of importance place, in terms of existing use or significance attributed on the relevant Aboriginal custom, former reputed use on the basis of tradition, historical association, Aboriginal sentiment, C, potential anthropological, archaeological, ethnographical interest, and aesthetic values. And the department now recognises that aesthetic values are not the values of some white fellow sitting in St George's Terrace looking at rock art, for example, but the full range of aesthetic values, which include people's feelings about the country they're in. So when someone says, this is a nice place to camp because you get a nice breeze in the afternoon, that's an aesthetic value. So I want to suggest that what we do in terms of Aboriginal cultural heritage is part of a statutory process. It does not, however, prevent us from routinely seeking non-statutory solutions to heritage issues. And most of us do this every day. Move that road, take that drill pad and put it over there. I recall one instance I was doing drill pads up on Rockley Station, and the elder had cleared the area, the archaeologist was now working on the drill pad, and as I was talking to him, this willy-willy came from our right, and my experience is, and I'm sure it was his as well, stopped in front of us momentarily and then moved on. And the elder said, that's the spirits coming to visit us, the old people. I think we better move that drill pad. And the drill pad was moved to another suitable location. So we do look for non-statutory solutions. However, when we need ministerial consent under Section 18, we have to obviously go through a statutory process. Anthropology and ethnography are central then, I would suggest, to the Aboriginal Heritage Act. Ethnographic survey is, of course, a key component in the process. Rim has just spoken about some of her experiences. Ethnography, in terms of the evaluative criteria, are central to evaluating the importance and significance of places, custom, tradition, sentiment, aesthetic values, sacred beliefs, and so on. And it's sacred beliefs and religious practices, ritual and ceremonial usage that override all other things that the committee have to consider. So I would suggest that essentially as ethnographers, we are providing expert reports in the statutory process that potentially can proceed to court. Now, I've been involved with several items, only one of which has actually gone to court, but several of which have gone through initial legal process. And when a lawyer is questioning about how your archaeologists measure the distance between an archaeological site and a water body, it becomes quite interesting. You know, when the archaeologists pace out and say, well, this archaeological site is 200 meters from the lake, and the lawyer wants to know, did you use measuring tape, GPS? Was it measured at the high water mark or the low water mark in winter or summer, and so on? So David has already mentioned some of the issues in terms of expert evidence in court. I think essentially it boils down to two. One is being able to demonstrate expertise. The other is being able to demonstrate independence. So you're providing the court, as a person, an expert who's responsible to court, with independent advice. And one of the first things opposition lawyers endeavour to do is to demonstrate that you're not independent. So I think independence and expert advice, whether we want to call it third space or whatever, I think is important. And I think one of the difficulties is that so many of the ethnographic reports are kind of reading, often in terms of desktop work, exhibit very little ethnography. Now, ethnography, as we know, typically, variously defined, but typically involves detailed observation of prolonged first-hand experience. However, what we do is extremely time compromised. Unlike, say, when Kingsley was doing his work initially, where he and others were working in regions, constantly collecting information, doing heritage studies as part of that process, and fitting that in. For example, some of you might have worked in the goldfields, looked at some of Ken Lieberman's stuff, very detailed. We don't have time to do that. Very time compromised. Very restricted scope, writing for very different audiences, Aboriginal community proponents, DPLH, the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Committee, and other agencies. I was surprised once when someone came to see me sitting here and said, I've just read a report of yours, it's online, and I was actually horrified because it was confidential. But the proponents had sent it on to the EPA, and the EPA published it all online. So without knowing that, it became interesting. So, rapid ethnographic methodologies, I think, are required in terms of what we do. And these various methodologies have been developed in various areas like health and community service, diagnostic procedures, education design, human-computer interaction, and heritage assessments, particularly in the US. These are some examples of various approaches to rapid ethnography, variously referred to as rapid ethnography, rapid ethnographic assessment, quick ethnography, focused ethnography, or Sarah Pink's short-term ethnography. They obviously have a number of similar characteristics: time limited, limited scope, project specific, often multi-member, multidisciplinary teams, and frequently we work alone, though I have worked on several projects where we've had, of course, both male and female anthropologists, sometimes several anthropologists, often multiple methods, what might be multi-sided. Triangulation of data is very important, intense short-term engagement, and the often, or at least focus on being data rich. Now, often these projects involve at least 3 months in various areas, or not more. Handwerker actually allows for a 3-day project, and that's sort of more akin to what we end up doing. Certainly down here in the southwest, you get 1 day in the field basically. So it is very rapid. Kaplan, Sheldon, Lowe, who studied heritage assessment at the Independence National Park, Historical Park in Philadelphia. These are some of the methods to use, but you can see the length of time they had. 6 days, 12 days, 10 days. Not something that we managed to do. But I would suggest that we do, in fact, use some of these methods. What they call focus groups. We are often involved in what we call on-site consultative meetings, which are effectively focus groups. We may meet on site. Meetings, of course, may be mobile, so we're working across the country, stopping, talking, inspecting various places. Drew Skinner and Beardsley recently reported on what they call the drive and talk. So they're working with people in South Australia, and farmers are driving them around the country, talking about it. They're learning, as I say, enables researchers to access, in terms of drivers' practices and knowledges of the places, landscapes through which it has. The difference is that in most situations, we tend to be the drivers because we're the authorised person. We have rented cars, we're authorised by the mining companies or whatever. Nevertheless, it's still an opportunity to engage with people as you're travelling through a country, or even if you're quite listening to people talk. There was one man I had the pleasure and privilege of working with for a couple of decades, and as we travelled from coast to inland Pilbara, at a certain point in the journey, he would always start to sing. And he would start to keep time. It'd be sotto voce, he'd be sitting beside me, and you could hear him, but he'd keep time with his hand. Important piece of ethnographic data that's actually featured later in a court case I was involved in. But of course, we've probably all experienced things. I always find it interesting that we've got years of knowledge about driving in the bush. And on one occasion, at an exploration camp, as I left the guys sitting around the fire after we finished breakfast, I went to pick up my gear. I heard one of the elders say, I'm not going with that white fella. I said, what do you mean, Gordon? He said, oh, I didn't mean you. I said, I'm the only bloody white fella here. So, nevertheless, an opportunity to acquire important ethnographic information. So as I said, undoubtedly we use a lot of these methods. What I think, however, is required is that we treat the data we collect ethnographically. Much of what we're involved with is consequential talk as a major part of our involvement, which may vary from sentences people exchange between one another to lengthy monologues. And typically, often what's neglected then is the analysis of the multimodal performative aspects of discourse and rhetorical frameworks used. I suggest that talk needs to be treated analytically and not merely reported on. And there's a whole range of methodologies for dealing with talk. Interestingly, the program that, the theory, the positional theory that Rimwood was referring to, I mean, Harry suggests that one of the key components of that is in fact talk. It's words people use between one another. So all too often we just get stuff reported on rather than treated analytically. Myself and my late colleague Ralph Locke identified three broad genres for people who talk about country: knowing the country, reading the country, feeling the country, recognizing that actors move back and forth between these genres and often, say, for what is felt today may be known for certain tomorrow. Tonkin suggests that the genres signal types of interpretations, provide horizons of expectations, i.e. frames for understanding, inherent claims of authority to speak, and include cards of identity. So every time people are talking, they're involved with identity work. It suggests that also that one of the things that often arises, certainly in the Southwest, is what can be referred to as contrastive rhetoric. This actually comes from educational sociology in Britain. So contrastive rhetoric is, at St. Patrick's we do things this way, but you should see what they do over the school over the road. and often used to highlight difference between young as and white fellows, including heritage consultants. People will be able to discern the true essence of cultural phenomenon, feel and experience differently the spirit world. Ken referred to the spirit world this morning. So, for example, in a recent survey I did, one of the participants said there's a lot of spiritualism around here, but you wouldn't understand because you lot build churches. And because that was said with a particular sneer, I responded appropriately, suggesting A, I did understand because I was Irish, we have lots of spirits in our country, and secondly, my grandfather was the seventh son of a seventh son, which brought with it big Maban, and he in fact was a healer. The other thing that often comes in is atrocity stories, cautionary tales. So one, for example, here is again in a recent study where the elder was suggesting that people needed to conduct say a smoking ceremony, something to dispel the danger of the project from the spirits when it started, and referred to a project in the wheat belt where the contractors didn't follow young Anne's advice, and one of the workers was killed in the fall. Of course, sometimes you just get cautions. I was involved in recording a really important men's site in the Pilbara. The people wanted it recorded. The area wasn't mineralized, but they were concerned it might be impacted upon. And having taken details from one of the men with me from the mining company, actually walked around the entire hill taking GPS readings, and we mapped the whole thing. And said, we really want you to record this and have this place protected, but don't tell Billy we've told you about it, he'll shoot you. Cautionary tale. So, very quickly suggest that heritage is dynamic, it's a dynamic, complex system. Merlin talks about epistemic openness in Aboriginal communities, whereas our colleague David Trigger and Fred Myers point out, this is often done within a detailed code or a set of rules emanating from the dreaming. Merlin cautions against a fixed heritage perspective or a purely constructive one. So in other words, he says, it's not the case that whatever people now say is ipso facto the case. I think we need to be aware of the strategic use of tradition, the sacralization or reinscription of the landscape, as again Martin Snedden and Trigger talk about. We need to be aware, is the information or cognizant of information incorporated, that means embodied oral tradition, or is it inscribed? Certainly when I started, people would put one another down by saying, well, he really doesn't know because he gets all this information from books. So if it is inscribed, how do we treat that? I was involved in a survey recently where I was asked what the desktop results showed, and before I could answer, one of the women involved in the group opened up her telephone and responded in terms of what she discovered by reviewing Daisy Bates's material, which was precisely the same as I had found. I think we need to be aware of changes over time and phenomena that may be assigned cultural values. A big thing at the moment around the metro area is limestone pinnacles. Certainly 30 years ago, they were interpreted differently. Heritage and consultative processes are both a political and economic resource, and we need to recognize that. The heritage may be used by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people as for non-heritage purposes. There are several of us here in this room who were involved in a project in the southwest where an anti-road group were constantly reporting various things, including scarred trees. Scarred trees, of course, which then get into the system and are taken at face value later. So I had a young archaeologist say to me the other day, oh, well, there's 50 scarred trees across the road. I had to point out that there weren't. That none of the scarred trees that were reported by this anti-road group, in fact, were, that's very good, isn't it? in fact, wear scar trees at all. So thank you. So heritage economy is a big issue. I think there's already been reference to this. When I first started, of course, the Aboriginal heritage was run by the museum. If you engage with people that were called guides, the fee was $47 a day. Now the standard fee, of course, is sometimes in the thousands. So it's a huge issue we need to be cognizant of. The dynamic nature of heritage and heritage assessment then allows new items to be added to the heritage economy. So, for example, the rumours that I have Joe Dorch has been doing some wonderful archaeological research, test pitting in various places. For the first time ever, I've heard Noongar people, as opposed to people I worked with in the Pilbara, want to undertake test pitting. So I think these are some of the issues we need to be concerned about. And just lastly, I'd like to say that the heritage economy, of course, is open to exploitation. There are examples, in fact, of extortion. People saying, well, you will need to pay me $75,000 before I'll talk to you, otherwise you won't get your Section 18. I think the Noongar Standard Heritage Agreement has restricted some of that, so that we're now dealing with local bodies who give us a list of people to deal with. However, having said that, talking about right people of the country, we now get lists of people that have a disclaimer on them which says they don't guarantee that the people are capable of undertaking the work or are the right people for country, which creates all sorts of problems. So, lastly, I think what we need to do is let's put ethnography back into ethnographic surveys. And saying that, I think there are two other points I'd like to make. One, of course, that requires adequate training in ethnography. I think there is a problem where lots of young anthropologists come straight into Aboriginal heritage work without having experienced work in other areas. So there's nothing really to compare the sort of information they're getting. And it is a shame, as has been mentioned, of course, already, or at least alluded to, the death of the anthropology department or school at UWA. It's gone from 30 anthropologists and sociologists or thereabouts to 2. One of them is a human geographer. So I really think that we need to look at more of this so that people can acquire skills and develop the competency to deal with a very, very complex issue. Thank you very much.